You're listening to EdTech Heroes, a podcast that looks at how teachers in today's classrooms can use technology to improve student learning. In each episode, a hero in the world of education will share their story and discuss how innovation can influence the minds of the next generation. Let's jump in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to EdTech Heroes. I'm Nef, and today's guest is Jon Bergmann. Jon is one of the pioneers of the flipped class movement and has coordinated flipped learning programs around the globe. Jon is the author of 10 books, including the best-selling book, Flip Your Classroom. And on top of that, he has been an educator since 1986, serving as a middle and high school science teacher, lead technology facilitator, consultant, public speaker, and is now back in the classroom. Jon, welcome to EdTech Heroes.
It's great to be with you. Thanks. And it sounds great. I've been teaching since 1986, but that means like I'm old. I'm an old guy.
Here we like to say that you have a lot of experience that you can impart on both me and our listeners.
All right.
Jon, I know that you have a lot of roles. You've been a writer, an influencer, an innovator. But I want to start with you as an educator and talk about this intersection between video and mastery-based learning. How does video empower you as a teacher in terms of executing the mastery learning model?
Well, mastery learning has been around a long time, and it was really, I guess, trumpeted and celebrated in the 1970s and 80s by Benjamin Bloom, kind of another ed hero from years gone by. But Ben Bloom, when he was showing how well mastery learning worked, like 1980s, the problem he had, well, there were two problems with mastery learning way back in the day. Problem number one was if you have direct instruction, when do you do it, right? If you've got 30 kids in a class, you got 6 classes a day, that's my reality. When do you do direct instructions if kids are, if you will, on a slightly different piece of the curriculum at a different time? And video solved that problem. FYI, the other problem was assessment. How do you deal with all these different versions of a test? What if a kid fails a test and then you have to then retake the test? And how do you manage that? Technology has solved that problem. It's not video has not solved that problem, but the video has solved that problem. So in my class today, for example, my students are by and large taking a major assessment. They will be here in an hour. And they're take a major assessment, but not every student will take the major assessment because not every student is ready for the major assessment. But what's happened is because they are at different places in the content, I have multiplied myself by making these cheesy videos that students are going to watch or have watched and are watching in preparation to get the basic part of the information. Then we use class time to do mastery learning where I am checking, looking over their shoulder, helping them on the struggling things. They're doing experiments. I'm a science teacher. They're doing all kinds of hands-on things to help them solidify and truly deeply understand the content that they're supposed to master.
Very cool. I wonder if you can walk us through a specific example. Maybe there's a unit that comes to mind and tell us what was taught in asynchronous video and what was the components of the lesson where you taught by peeking over a student's shoulder.
Well, might as well use the unit that my kids are finishing as we speak. So I teach 2 subjects. I'll take my chemistry class. And right now we're at the end of our level 7. I call it levels. I've gamified the class also. We're at the end of level 7 in the year, and they are taking their boss battle, which is their major assessment today-ish. All right. So I had 4 different videos that I created on the topic of states of matter, solids, liquids, and gases, and how they undergo changes, some really cool things about how things boil. So for example, when you think about boiling, you think about heating up a pot of water on the stove. That's true, but there's more than one way to boil something. For example, if you reduce the pressure, you can boil. So I made videos basically with here's the content, kind of learn this stuff. So when they walked into class, let's take this lesson about boiling. We walked into class the day that most of them should have been on the boiling. All right. I did do a whole class thing where I said, all right, here's this deal. I've got a pot of boiling water or it's a flask of boiling water. And then what I did is I then sealed the flask of boiling water, turned it upside down, put some ice on top, and it continued to boil for the rest of the class. So I was boiling water with ice by reducing the pressure. And so then they had to spit. So this is a very difficult, what in science we call a discrepant event. Doesn't make sense to add ice to something and it boils, right? But I did. And so that was something I wanted to do in class. That's something you have to see visually. I mean, I could have made a video of me doing that, but it's so much better for them to sit and wrestle with that. That's the hard stuff. The easy stuff was what is boiling. And there's some charts and graphs that they have to learn how to master, et cetera, et cetera. So in class, we're doing a hands-on activity, or that's actually more me hands-on. The next day, they did something with a soda can, and they actually allowed the atmosphere to crush it with exactly the same principle that we had. And then in class, I've got assigned questions that are taking them deeper. Like, what happens if you were to step out of your spaceship was one of the questions. Without your spacesuit, what would happen is your blood would boil. It would be a very horrible death, by
Mm.
the way. But that's an application of what happens to liquids when they are subjected to extremely low pressure. Or what would happen if you were at the top of a mountain in Colorado or Himalayas or something like that? What would happen if you are trying to cook your coffee? So those are the kinds of questions that they're working on in the class that I'm looking over the shoulder on with them. But they've watched these short, cheesy videos. I think the videos were 15 minutes max, maybe 12. They're watching these short videos before class. So they got introduced to the concepts, and now they
Mhm.
can work now somewhat asynchronously. Even they're not all working together. Not all the kids in the same class are working on the same thing. So group A is working on these questions and group B on this questions. Even when I said there's that lesson, the interesting thing is not every kid was on that specific lesson on that day, because some kids were a little bit further advanced, some were a little bit further behind. So they're all at a slightly different page, if you will, in the curriculum
Mhm.
in the classroom.
Interesting. And how do you manage that? I know that one of the core principles that you live by is what you call extreme differentiation,
Yep.
which means that arguably all 30 students could be doing something different at the exact same time. How do you manage that?
The answer is you can't have 30 kids doing 30 different things or
Hmm.
you'll go crazy. So what you have to do is try to get them clumped. And so literally I've probably got four groups, if you will, or four different levels at the same time in a class, because I can't manage 30 different ones. And
Mhm.
and what's always happened is in master classrooms, not mine, but also classrooms all over the world. I work with teachers literally in every continent. And what they're doing is the same ideas. You got to clump your students in certain ways. And you also have to find ways to differentiate. So, like, for example, in the previous unit, what I did is it was the hardest unit and probably the most critical unit in all of chemistry. And there were five different lessons. Well, lesson number 1, 2, and 3 were critical for the rest of the year. Lesson 4 and 5 were not. And so the way
Mhm.
I was able to kind of, because I also logistically want to keep the kids roughly on the same page. Otherwise, it becomes a logistical nightmare. So what I basically have said is everybody has to get through lesson 3, if you will. But those who get through lesson 4 or 5 basically get bonus points. And so there's a motivation for them to move on to that. But for the students who are struggle the most, I was able to get them all through levels or lessons 1, 2, and 3. And if I were to kind of do a percentage in my classes, I would say a third got through everything through lesson 5.
Mhm.
I think I was at about 25% who only got to level 1, if you will, or lesson 3. And then the other 75% were probably evenly split, roughly. So there's different ways to do that. Another way I've done sort of extreme differentiation is that I actually write different tests. So when they get to the end of the level or the unit, if you will, then the students can take the easy test, the medium test, or the hard test, or I call it the basic understanding, the clear understanding, or the deep understanding. It's really a rubric basically that I'm using. And then the students choose their own adventure and they can choose
Wow.
which one they want to take. And obviously, from a sort of a point perspective, my school is still very traditional in terms of its grading systems. You get more points if you take the hard tests, but they have to all score a minimum score to even consider passing. So if they don't pass the test, they have to take it again and again and again. Depends how many times they take it. I typically try to limit it to 3 attempts so that they have a little more incentives. When I used to say any number of attempts, what's often happens, the kids would take it 10 times and just keep trying to game the system, even though my test changes every time. It also was way too much of my time trying to monitor 10 different tests from too many students. Yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. I love this idea of students being able to choose their adventure both in learning, but also in assessment. Can you tell us a little bit about how many students are consistently choosing the hard adventure or perhaps the biggest boss?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm ballparking it right now. I think that's about right, but I don't know the exact number. I should collect that data.
Even
I've
as a
never done that.
ballpark, that
Yeah.
strikes me as an incredibly high number.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is motivating students to go after the big boss? Is it extrinsic? Is it intrinsic? Is it something else?
You know what I think it is This is going to sound weird, but I think it's relationship.
Hmm.
What makes good teaching good? It's always been this way, regardless of whether you flip or whether you use mastery, whatever, is how can you build relationship with kids? And so I spend a lot of time trying to getting to my kids. And as I get to know my kids, I'm going to try and challenge them and say, man, you really could go for the big one. Come on. So I'm pushing kids to try to take the more advanced route. And I hope my kids, I feel like I've got a good relationship with students and they know that I care. So honestly, that's what I think is what's going to cause kids to want to do more for you. And then
Mhm.
really, ultimately, sometimes they see it's more for them really when it's all said and done, but sometimes they don't see that. So
That makes a lot of sense. And I think what's interesting, I read some of your material and it sounds like your flipped classroom approach is something that you attribute to your ability to be able to build deeper relationships with your students. Can you talk about how those two things actually jive with each other?
yeah, so I mean, my first 19 years of as a teacher, so this is my 35th year in education or sixth, or I don't know, it's a lot. My first 19 years, I was a traditional teacher. And so I stood up in front
Mhm.
of the board room and the board, or I had a PowerPoint or whatever it was back in the day, and I did the lecture thing. And one thing about lecture, even though I was a good lecturer, right? I'm actually a very good lecturer. It creates a separation between you and your students in many ways because
Mm.
you're standing up to the stage on the stage deal. But now my whole job is walking around and helping kids. I'm a roamer. I mean, I'm roaming and helping kids, but in helping kids on chemistry and physics and geology and whatever I'm teaching them, I get to know them more because I have more time. I mean, if you take, like, let's say we have a 90-minute block here, right? So if I were
Mhm.
being a traditional teacher, if I was going to lecture, probably I wouldn't lecture 90 minutes, but I'd lecture, if I was a traditional teacher, I might lecture for 45 minutes and then have 45 minutes to work on stuff. But right now, since I lecture zero, I have not lectured in since 2007. Okay. So I don't know. That's a lot of years. Then I now have 90 full minutes to walk around and spend time with kids.
Mm.
Most of the time it's me doing quick formative assessments with them and saying what's going on with this, et cetera, et cetera. And that builds those opportunities for the relationships to build. And, I know what's going on with the kids that I'll ask about their basketball game or their chess tournament, whatever it is they're into, because you get to know what those things are as you're spending time and you get to know
Mhm.
them. And yeah, I mean, would just say time. I have more time than the average teacher to hang around and talk to kids. And again, it's not just about hanging around and talking about, I don't know, their favorite band or stuff like that. Sometimes that might come up, but usually it's around the content of what I teach. And
Mhm.
it's awesome. Yeah.
I like it. And I want to drill down on this idea of constant formative assessment. It sounds like in your classroom that can take many different forms. And
Yeah.
sometimes it might just be a question. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach formative assessment in your room?
So the students are working through, in my mastery system, I've got very specific objectives. So like
Mhm.
the lessons that we just did, there were 4 key lessons. And in those lessons, there were some assigned questions that they were supposed to work on. And then when they felt like they had mastered lesson 1, or we actually call it mission 1, they've mastered mission 1, they bring me evidence that they have mastered mission 1. I then look over the evidence and then I'm going to ask a key question. I'm going to look at their evidence and I'm going to make sure that they understand it. And I might ask a key question from the assigned questions they have, or I might ask a different question that's related and more application related to what they were doing. So,
Hmm.
for example, we've been talking about the effects of altitude on air pressure in this unit that we're doing right now. But then I had a conversation. I said, all right, some of them are athletes. I'd say you're an athlete. I don't know if you ever heard of this concept of blood doping. So I'd give them a little bit of background on blood doping, where people will live at altitude or actually take some of their own blood, give it back to themselves. Like this is classically happens with like endurance athletes, marathoners, or like cyclists or stuff like that. And I'm a cyclist, I'm a triathlete, so I kind of understand this world. And I said,
Mhm.
what is going on with that? So can you explain to me, use the concept that you learned about air pressure and the fact that there's more red blood cells in someone's body when they blood dope. So that's the kind of conversations that you can have with your students as they've been learning the sort of base knowledge of how air pressure works, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had this conversation and it's just so rich. It's like, wait, Mr. Bergman, so how would that work? And that was yesterday, a conversation with a couple of young ladies, and we were having a fascinating conversation about blood doping because I'm sitting around just in my room, right here. I'll turn here. Yeah. Right. This is my
That's
room, sitting down with a group of kiddos having that conversation.
I love that. And I really like that you have the opportunity to apply this knowledge at a base level to something that is actually interesting to students,
Yep.
that feels relevant, that is aligned with some of their interests. I want to take two steps back because something that you said was also revelatory to me. You said that students decide when they feel like they've mastered and they come up and show you the evidence. I would imagine that when students join your classroom for the first time, the way that you teach is almost contradictory to the way that they've been asked to learn prior in their careers. So, how do you get students ready to decide when they feel like they've mastered it? What does that look like to get students to start thinking metacognitively and be a part of this mission of your classroom?
Well, the first few days of mastery learning is all about teaching them how to do mastery learning because
Hmm.
they have not learned this way before. And so I teach them, for example, how to watch a video. That's the first day. How do you watch an instructional video? They know how to watch Spider-Man or the next latest Marvel thing. This is not the same thing, right? How do you take notes? I teach them how to take Cornell notes. So we go through that process. But then we say, all right, now you're in mission number one and you need to show me your evidence. And the way I primarily will at first teach them to do this is I just will come around and say, where's your evidence? I will harass them until they give me their evidence. And then eventually they get the message. It's like, oh, Mr. Bergman, I've got 7.3 done. Can we go over it? Yes, now
Mm,
we can go. And one thing that oftentimes it depends on the topic matters. For example, like in chemistry, sometimes they're just learning how to solve a certain type of sort of a mathematical problem. But for example, and that's not always the case. But for example, in a geology class, it's more opportunity. They'll say, I want you to ask me a question about what you've learned about volcanoes. What are you intrigued about with volcanoes? There's a lesson on volcanoes when I taught a geology class. And then they're bringing a question that they have about, and oftentimes it's like, I don't know, because I'm a chemist teaching geology, so I'm not a volcanologist. We're going to pull it. I said, let's look it up, pull Google up, and we say, all right, let's check this out and see if we can find the answer to your question. They might ask, so why does this volcano explode and that one not explode? And one, so all these kinds of things. So,
got it. Got it. So I think that this will feel similar to lots of educators who are listening because I think the idea of teaching students how to behave, how to learn in your classroom is not a foreign concept. We probably all do that in the beginning part of the year. But I
yeah,
think what you are advocating is that when we want to engage in mastery based learning, flipped learning, or any sort of new pedagogical style, that we do that on top of asking them to buy into our classroom culture, which is interesting.
yeah.
You you also talked about teaching students how to engage with instructional videos, which I
Mhm.
think is a very foundational concept. And often we hear teachers say, you know what, I tried instructional videos, but I don't
Mhm.
think students quite learned in the way that I thought they would. Or this just didn't work. And perhaps there is no real reason as to why it didn't work. But what I might posit is that the reason that it didn't work is that students didn't know how to engage with those
That's so
videos.
right.
So, can you give us a couple of pragmatic tips? What do you tell your students in terms of how they watch instructional videos?
So this is the big issue. I mean, a lot of people, for example, will say, "I flipped my classroom and it didn't work because I assigned a video and then the results didn't come out very well, and so I'm going to go back to lecture." And
Hmm.
what they have done is they have not really thought through what's required in them watching a video. So it's super important to teach them how. I think that's actually the most important thing is that I will take 2 full days of class teaching my students how to watch a video. What I'm really doing is I'm teaching them how to take notes and interact with the video, right? So they're watching a video that I've created, which is weird, by the way. They're watching a video in class of me where I could be standing there in front of them. But of course, the beauty of that, actually, here's what I do. First day is I'll say, all right, let's watch this instructional video. And I put it up on the big monitor deal in the class projector thing. And I say, who wants to be in charge of the clicker? All right, are you all okay? Take notes. And some kids monitoring the video and they'll say, oh, pause. And I just kind of let it just flow. And by the end of class, and they wait, no, go fast, fast. So they're arguing with this poor child who's got the button. the pause. And some kids are really frustrated because they want to go faster. And some kids want to go slower. And they're having, it's the classic of the teacher who's doing the PowerPoint. It's like, oh no, go back. Can you go back for, that
Mhm.
whole job in there? And I just let that happen. And then at the end of this, and it's lesson number 1 about matter and energy. So it's whatever my first video is. And I let this all go and let it just fall apart. And then I say, were you guys frustrated? What would have been better? Well, it would have been better if we could all control the video ourselves. I said, that's a good idea. What if I let you do that for the rest of the year? So that's the point. Let's see what's wrong with that. And you're right. You're also teaching them that if you had control of the pause button yourself,
Hmm.
it'd be so much better. Sometimes I've also done this where I have this, I call it the origami frog video. So I have this video that shows you how to make an origami frog, and I put it up on the screen and they watch the video, and then I do not push stop at all. And 1/3 of the kids can make the frog. The rest of them can't. And it's because the teacher's teaching at one pace. It's, and I said, again, how would you have been successful? All of you have been
Mhm.
successful at the frogs. What if you each had it on your laptop? I gave you the YouTube link and you just all did it. Oh, what if you could do that for the rest of the year? So tips, sorry, I'm getting back to your question. So tip number 1 is definitely teach them how to do it. Other tips that I've seen, mistakes I see people make all the time is they make their videos too long. So
Hmm.
really short, one topic per video, just get to it, get out of it. Don't go on some, weird tangent thing. It's just to be that. Another thing I see people make mistakes of is they put too hard a content in the videos. The
Hmm.
point of the video is probably to introduce the content. So from a Bloom's perspective, Bloom's taxonomy perspective, you want to be at the lower levels of cognition, just the knowledge and understanding. You want to use application, analysis, synthesis stuff in class. So do the hard stuff when you're present with your students. In the flipped learning world, we divide the world into what we call independent space and group space. Independent is what they can do alone, and you want to have easier cognitive tasks for them to do there when they're doing this in a asynchronous place at home or whatever it is independent. They might be in their planet before school, whatever they're doing. And then in class, that's where you want to do the hard stuff. One of
Hmm.
my problems in mastery learning is that, and I have to really work with my students on, is they think, well, the next thing is to watch the video, and they'll be watching the video in my class. I'll say, let's talk about this. What's wrong with this picture? What's the easier thing for you to do when you're not in this room? Watch the video. I said, if you're stuck on a question, where would you like to be? In the room with you, Mr. Bergman. Right. Not at home, because they have some freedom on what they're going to do and how they choose their adventure.
Mhm.
But if you're doing all this extra work at home, the hard stuff, your parents likely can't help you with chemistry anymore. They probably, maybe many of them took chemistry, but it was 20 years ago and they probably don't remember high school chemistry. So it's like, oh, so it is teaching them and showing them sometimes the obvious thing. So
Hmm. I really like that in terms of putting students in positions where they have a light bulb moment about their own learning.
yep.
And I think that that becomes so much more valuable than you saying from day one, hey, you get to pause the video. That is not revelatory yet. They don't understand why that actually matters.
Yeah.
Or you being able to say something along the lines of, you get to decide how you're going to learn and where you're going to complete different tasks. They also don't understand the value in being able to complete that task with you being there to aid them. So I absolutely love that. I want to turn it around for a second. So you gave us some tips for how our students can be better video watchers. But I'm curious, what tips do you have for us as educators to be better video creators? And you started that a little bit in terms of creating short videos, but what else have you learned over the years?
There's this guy, Dr. Myers, I forget his first name, but he has these lists of how to make good multimedia. He has these 7 or 10 principles. I don't know the exact
Mhm.
number, but a lot of it has to do with not having everything being crazy busy. So if you've got a screen, if you're doing some kind of a screencasting kind of a video, make it really simple, right?
Mm.
Another thing they talk about is talking more conversational tone. So if it's just kind of vary your voice, but make it more conversational and not sort of deep academic,
Hmm.
highfalutin language. Another thing that he says in some of his principles, there's specific sort of scientific or academic names for these. There's something effect, though. It's always this effect, this effect. And the names of the effects are escaping me. But another one that would definitely be applicable that we've definitely found to be true is if you're making your own videos, they're going to be more bought into it than if you're using a video that you found on YouTube. Not to say that there
Mm.
aren't great videos on YouTube. So many teachers actually use my videos on YouTube, but I encourage them to not. I encourage them to make their own videos. I mean, it's okay to start using somebody else's videos from YouTube or whatever, but I would really encourage you to make your own. Again, that gets back to that relationship. Kids will
Mhm.
connect more with you. And honestly, there's a certain way that I teach a particular topic that's to find somebody who teaches it in the same way or thinks about it in the same way as me online. It's going to be very difficult to find that. And I could spend hours and hours searching for the perfect YouTube video, or I can just fire up a tool like Screencastify, and I could just like record a video in 8 minutes, an 8-minute video, 'cause it's something I know a lot about, and then be
Mhm.
done. I mean, it's just silly to not just make your own. I mean, it's
I really, really like the concept of making your own video. And what I have also said in the past is not only do you want to teach the content in a way that is specific to you, but you also know your learners way more than anybody on YouTube does.
yeah.
If I sat down and fired up one of your videos, I'm sure it would be great.
Yeah.
However, you don't know my kids and you don't know our inside joke from last week that actually helps them understand something. So there is so much value in being able to create your own videos, including relationship building. But even beyond that, if we just think of it in terms of students being able to understand the content.
I think it's also that another advantage of your own videos is you can contextualize it even for we all teach the cultures of our schools are different,
Mm-hmm.
ethnically, just the culture of the school itself. And so if you could bring in those kinds of features that will be more applicable to the individual culture of your school, whatever that looks like,
Hmm.
obviously that's going to have a deeper connection with your kids. They're going to learn better. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a
Yeah.
duck thing, but a lot of people are what I often hear when people say, they're afraid about making their own video is that they say, well, I don't like my voice when I
Mhm.
hear it on video or whatever. And I then get scientific and say, I hate to tell you this, but do you realize that when you hear yourself recorded, that's how everybody hears you? Because when you hear your voice, like when I'm talking right now and I'm listening to my voice, scientifically, or I'm a scientist, we're actually hearing through what's called bone conduction. It sounds differently than what is recorded, but when it's recorded, that's actually really how it sounds. So you don't like how you sound, I'm sorry, but that's how they actually hear you. So it's not going to be any different, no different experience for your students than if you're talking normally to them. So, so
Sure.
but honestly, I think that if we look at what's happened in the last 2 years, whatever, almost more 2 years now, but pandemic stuff, is that a lot of teachers have gotten over that because they had no choice but to figure out
Hmm.
how to record themselves, Zoom meeting. I mean, everything that they had to do is that if there's been any silver lining to the pandemic educationally, is a lot of the, if I will call it the technological barriers to flipped and mastery learning have all been vaporized because teachers now know how to use those technological tools because they were forced to. They had no choice or because their kids were in some other place teaching. So
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that whether we like it or not, one silver lining, if there could ever be a silver lining of a global pandemic, is that it has forced us to confront teaching and learning and think about the ways in which technology can make it better, which
yeah.
is good, right? This is something that we want to continue to refine and continue to make better, especially as we teach new generations of learners.
Mastery learning, I've written some pieces and spoken. There's been sort of a topic I've done at conferences in the last,
Hmm.
6 months or something. If you think about mastery learning, it really is the ideal strategy for, call it post pandemic learning. So at my school, we were able to be open except for about those first 3 months. We had masks on the whole deal.
Hmm.
But a lot of the schools around us were not that case. So, for example, this semester, I've got two new students who'd come from other schools where their education, for lots of reasons, was pretty subpar. And so they came into the class very far behind their peers. And, but the beauty of mastery learning, it's like, all right, I did basically kind of a diagnostic test with each of them and said, where should we start you? Because I can't start you with where everybody else is at. I have to start you before that because you never learned these things from your previous teacher. So where should we start? And so I figured out where that is. And then I've been working with these students individually and helping them to get caught up. And so if you think about this, mastery learning is a way because every teacher is facing the same issue. Let's be honest, whether it's, in my particular case, which is these two transfer students at semester, but what's happening across the world is as students return to school, they're coming in with many, many deficiencies in their and gaps in their learning. And they're all coming in with very different experiences. And so if we do mastery learning, I really think it's the answer. It's kind of a bold statement. It's the answer to what's going on with our students as they come back to school,
Hmm.
and to deal with the varied levels of comprehension or lack thereof that they're coming with in whatever content and curriculum that we're teaching. So, in fact, I just finished a book on mastery learning. It's going to be called the Mastery Learning Handbook. Comes out in October, which is like a step-by-step guide to teach
Hmm.
teachers how do you actually make this happen? The logistics, how do you make it a reality every day in your class? And I interviewed 30 different mastery learning teachers across the world. And of course, my own experiences in my own classroom. And it was just, how do you do it? How do you make it happen?
Hmm.
And because the logistics will kill you if you're, that's the key. So, anyways, yeah,
I think that's right in terms of this being an answer to this broader conversation around learning loss or what we do after COVID-19, however we might want to phrase that conversation. But I think the other thing to throw out into the ether is that this is not something that is new or something that is wholly specific to COVID-19. If we pulled a sixth grade teacher and asked them, "What's your biggest challenge?" they might tell us that students from different elementary schools come in at different levels of proficiency and they have to figure out how to work with that. The same is
right,
probably true of ninth grade teachers or teachers who are in schools with large populations of children who might transfer in and transfer out, whether
yeah,
that be from a different school, from a different country, or whatever the case may be. So I think this is another instance in which we're having a collective conversation about something that COVID-19 has brought to the forefront, but it has always been lurking in the back. And it's cool to think about unique ways to solve it.
yeah. COVID-19 has exacerbated a problem that's always there. Every teacher in the world, you have a conversation with them, they have this
Mhm,
problem, but it's not worse, right? In fact, I
mhm,
opened the new book with a story of two Department of Defense math teachers who teach in Germany. And one of the issues with Department of Defense kids is that the parents often are transferred into different Air Force bases. They're at an Air Force base, different bases all the time. And so they get kids who oftentimes they might have a month off of school because they're moving from California to Germany. And then they've
mhm,
lost a month of learning. But then they're also coming from another school where so they basically give them a diagnostic test. I mean, right? This is just their reality. It's been their reality since for years and years and years. So they said, "Oh, mastery is the way to do it." And so they've got this just amazing mastery program that they do as they are trying to, make this a reality. So that was pre-pandemic, and now it's even worse. But now everybody's experiencing this even more than they have in the past. So mastery just makes sense. I mean, we have this thing in some weird, but I think that there's a unwritten sort of assumption made in the world of education that says this:
mhm,
if you learn fast at the pace I give you, you're smart.
hmm,
If you don't learn fast or you don't learn at the pace that I can teach you, then you're stupid. Because that's how we reward kids, right? Because test is on Tuesday, good luck. And if you fail, oh well, I guess you can move on. We're just going to move on. And too bad, you got a D or whatever, and we just move on. And I need to be honest, is that's basically what I did for 19 years, right? It's like, okay,
hmm.
test is on Tuesday, good luck. On Wednesday, I moved on to the next topic, and some kid got a 98. Whoo, I'm very happy for myself. And then one kid got a 42, and I just moved on. But the beauty of mastery is when the kid gets the 42, it's like, all right, let's do a diagnosis. What did you do wrong? So this
Mhm,
morning, as kids took this, most of them took this test. All right. I would say I rang the gong. I have a gong. So when they pass the test, they get a gong. I rang the gong 6 or 7 times, and the rest of them, so who took it, did not pass. They didn't get an 80%. And so, but at that moment, it's like, let's talk about what is missing. What is it that you didn't understand? And so
mhm.
that you can be prepared for the second time you do this. Let's figure out what you did wrong. And so we had another formative assessment over a summative assessment, but let's diagnose what you did wrong. And we did that. And now they know what they need to go do before they come for, attempt number two.
Very cool. So, we have a segment here at EdTech Heroes where we ask every single one of our heroes for some tips for teachers. And I'm particularly keen to ask you this question because you are fresh out of giving some really good tips for teachers looking to implement mastery-based learning. So, obviously, our listeners should keep a lookout for your book in October. But if you had to piece out one of the tips or one of the strategies that you put there for teachers who are brand new to mastery based learning, where do they start? What's your advice?
So from a mastery, I had a different idea for a different tip that wasn't related to mastery, but it's really important that you get super organized if you're going to do mastery learning.
Hmm,
So you have to very much sit and look at your content and say, what is the lesson and
hmm,
how? So here is an objective, a specific objective. I want them to learn X. Okay. Then I have to then say, how can they demonstrate that? Or what are some either some questions or some skills that they need to show to demonstrate whatever that lesson topic is? And then you've got to create these things. So I create these packets. Here's a packet, right? So this is the next packet right here. So there's a packet, and then I've got a list of the objectives on this page.
hmm.
And then there are the assignment. Here's an experiment they're going to do. And then there are assignments. Yeah. And so it's be organized. Maybe another tip in that regard. One thing I had done years ago, and I restarted this year, I'm so happy that I did, is I've have them create an interactive notebook. So they have this
Hmm.
notebook. There's a certain format, again, that part of the beginning of the year, teaching them how to create the interactive notebook. So that has most of them have roughly the same thing, but there's still some freedom on how you do that. I've got a couple of students they're in the special ed program, or a few who are in the special program, but a couple of them in particular who say that system doesn't work for me. Can I use this system? And yes, of course, they've got a different system that works for them, and I'm okay. So that's been something that's been helpful, is to give them kind of a structure. I find that giving kids a good structure, then they don't lose all their stuff. When they lose everything, and so if they have it all in one place in one notebook, for some reason they don't tend to lose that one notebook. So they use tape and scissors and colored markers, stuff like that. So my other big tip, let me give you a tip. I'm just free for what to work, that isn't related to mastery, that I would
Okay.
encourage you to do. This is something that I did in the pandemic that I think was the best thing I did all year. I've kept doing it because it's been so powerful. And actually, I use Screencastify for this. Is
Cool.
I had my kids for 2/3 of the year or whatever it was, right? And then they got taken away, right, so to speak, and they
Hmm,
were all in a Zoom room for a long time. And, I taught juniors and I taught a number of seniors, and I thought, I'll never see these kids again. They're awesome, right? And so I said, you know what? I want to give them a parting thought. And so what I did is I just turned on the screen capture or the video capture, whatever, webcam
hmm,
capture, whatever it's called, feature. And I said, and I just talked to them.
hmm.
I made a 3-minute video for each child and said, you know what, Begonia, you know what I see in you? Da, 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 da. And I really appreciate how you've done this in the class. Da, 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 da. And I mean, I got emails back from the kids in tears. Their parents were in tears. I mean,
Oh,
it's a way to personalize it, just say that you matter and I see you. And I've continued to do that. And that makes a huge difference because again, it's about building relationship.
hmm.
So I would encourage people to do things like that. Another way to do that, maybe not just at the end of the year, that's sort of just a capstone, but if you're grading papers, another use of video, I'm just ramping here, is what I do on that. I especially did this with my geology class. The kids would turn in an assignment, just a paper, and I would fire up Screencastify, and then I would be grading their paper. So I'd read their paper and kind of give a gist of
Hmm,
the idea. And then I fire up Screencastify with their paper on the screen and my face is in the corner or whatever. And then I highlight and I make some comments on their paper. And those comments, then I share via Google Drive or whatever. And
hmm,
then the students then have a video of me commenting on their paper as opposed to the paper with all the red X's and,
hmm.
52, 65, what a grade you're going to give them, or A minus or B plus or whatever. There's actually me talking to my students. And again, that builds that relationship that makes a huge difference. It's super easy to do. In fact, I honestly think it takes less time than to write out all the comments and try to explain it out. I honestly think it's time savings. It saves me. I can do that faster than I can do writing it all out. So
Certainly. And I was an English teacher, so I know the struggle of confronting a stack of 150 essays and knowing that it is going to take hours and hours to grade. And I started to use exactly that strategy.
yeah,
And what I found was that even as you are marking up a paper with a pen, you're having this conversation in your head. right? About like why you're doing that and what you want that student to get from that particular comment. And what's cool about turning your feedback into video is that students get to be privy to that conversation. And I think that we've talked a lot about the logistics of mastery based learning, but there also are logistical nightmares in traditional teaching. When I tried to conduct a writing conference and I didn't have time to do it, right? So, all of these ways in which technology might actually solve some of these logistical problems while also giving us an opportunity to build authentic relationships and contribute to deeper learning. I absolutely love that. I've got
Yeah, yeah.
one
You're doing a writing conference with your students,
for sure.
asynchronously instead of because it's impossible with 30 kids to really get and what do you do with the other 29 when you're doing the writing conference with
Mhm.
if you really wanna focus in on them, yeah, that's basically that's the you can multiply yourself with these videos. You have to read the papers anyways, you might as well just push
Right.
record. I mean, right? Oh, yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So I know your students are about to tackle the big boss in just a few minutes and they're going to come flooding into your room. So I have just one more question for you. What are some of your favorite resources to share with teachers, perhaps even some that you've written?
I guess if you're most interested in mastery learning right now or the flip to mastery learning, our first book that I wrote there in Sam's Flip Your Classroom, that was the book that has had sold the most copies. We really talk about the mastery learning. That was the genesis of the mastery learning thing. So the second half of that book, or listen, maybe the from 2/3 to the end. I don't know what do we call it? The last third, I guess you'd say. The last third really goes over
Mhm.
a little brief about the flip mastery model. And the new book, of course, is going to be just full book on the topic. But I would encourage people to pick that up. I also, if you just go to my website, it's johnbergman.com. John has no H and Bergman has two N's. I would encourage you to hop on there. I send out newsletters. I've got a podcast so you can listen
Hmm.
about mastery learning. I'm going to shoot one a little bit later this afternoon. That's both a video and an audio podcast where I'll talk about how this test went. And I
Mhm.
don't know, I think I got 17 or 20 or I don't know, episodes. They're 5 minutes long, maybe. There might be one that's 12. I mean, that's kind of the kind of ballpark range, just quick tips as I'm learning about mastery learning. So I encourage people to do that. Yeah. There's a great chat every Monday night if you're into Twitter, Flip Class Chat. So hashtag Flip Class Chat. They have a great opportunity to connect with other people. And I probably in there 1 out of 4 weeks. It's every Monday night at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern time. So if that's something that's interesting to you, that's a great group of educators that you could connect with.
Very cool. Lots of things that people can potentially tap into to learn more about mastery based learning, flipped learning, potentially video creation, and tons of things that you have talked about during this episode. John, I so appreciate you joining EdTech Heroes. And listeners, be sure to follow John on Twitter. He is at Jon Bergmann. Remember, no H and two N's in Bergman. Or you can visit his website at johnbergman.com to learn more about flipped learning and mastery based learning. I am your host, Nef Dukes, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of EdTech Heroes, presented by Screencastify.